It was Halloween night, and Emma, Jake, and Sarah decided to prove they weren't scared of the local legend. Everyone in town knew the story of Hargrave Mansion, the old house on the hill. They said a shadow haunted it, a dark curse that would swallow anyone who dared to enter on Halloween. But the trio didn't believe in ghosts. They thought it was all just stories to keep kids away. "Let's go check it out," Jake said, grinning. Emma and Sarah hesitated, but agreed. It was just an old house, right? As they reached the mansion, the air seemed to change, colder, heavier. The towering, crumbling structure loomed over them, its windows dark like dead eyes. The gates screeched as they pushed it open, and their footsteps echoed on the cracked stone path. "This place is creepy," Sarah whispered, hugging herself. "Come on, it's just a house," Emma said, trying to sound brave. They climbed the stairs and pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, the sound slicing through the eerie silence. Inside, everything was dark and cold, the smell of dust and decay in the air. Their flashlights flickered as they moved deeper into the mansion. "Let's just take a quick look and leave," Jake said, his voice quieter now. As they stepped into the main hall, something felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch and move on their own. Emma's flashlight flickered again, casting long, twisted shapes on the walls. Then they heard it. Faint footsteps behind them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them. They spun around, and their flashlights flickered out, leaving them in pitch-black darkness. "What the hell?" Jake shouted. Emma fumbled with her flashlight, her hands shaking. When she finally got it to turn on, the beam caught something in the corner of the room. A shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow. It moved. It was tall, featureless, and its red eyes glowed in the dark. "Oh my God," Emma screamed. The shadow began to move toward them, shifting across the floor like a living thing. Sarah backed away, her voice trembling. "We need to leave now." They turned to run, but the shadow was faster. It shot forward, blocking their path, growing larger as it filled the room with darkness. Jake swung his flashlight at it, but the light did nothing. The shadow wrapped around him, pulling him into the dark. Jake screamed, but it was cut short. In an instant, he was gone. "Jake," Emma yelled, but there was no sign of him, just a shadow growing stronger. "Run!" Emma grabbed Sarah's arm, and they sprinted down the hallway, hearts pounding. The shadow followed, its red eyes glowing, its whispers echoing through the halls. "You can't escape." They stumbled into a room at the end of the hall, slamming the door behind them. Sarah was crying now, her breath ragged. "What was that? What's happening?" "I don't know," Emma whispered, shaking, "but we need to get out of here." Just as she said that, the door creaked. The shadow was oozing under the crack, filling the room with darkness. Its voice, low and chilling, whispered again, "You're next." Sarah screamed as the shadow lunged at her. Emma watched it in horror as it swallowed Sarah, whole, her body disappearing into the black void. The shadow's red eyes turned to Emma. Desperate, Emma ran for the window, throwing it open and leaping outside. She hit the ground hard but scrambled to her feet, running as fast as she could down the hill. Behind her, the mansion seemed to groan, the shadow watching her from the doorway, its red eyes burning in the darkness. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of the town, breathless and terrified, but even then she knew the curse wasn't over. The shadow had claimed its victims, but someday it would come for her too. I'm 33 years old, and yeah, I love trick-or-treating. Sure, it's mostly for kids, but I've always been drawn to the magic of Halloween. The costumes, the candy, the thrill of walking through the night under glowing porch lights. So every year I throw on a costume and hit the streets. No shame. This Halloween was no different. It was late, maybe around 10:30 p.m. Most of the kids had gone home, and I was checking for the houses that still had on their porch lights. The streets were quieter now, with just a few houses still handing out candy. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. As I was walking down one dimly lit street, I noticed something odd. A woman was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, just ahead of me. She wasn't moving, just standing there, dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, like something out of a different time. Her head was tilted down, and her hair hung over her face, messy and tangled. I slowed down, unsure if she was a part of some elaborate Halloween prank, but something about her made me uneasy. Her clothes looked too real, too old. Maybe she was lost. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you lost?" I called out, trying to sound friendly. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. She just stood there, still as a statue, her head bowed. My heart started to beat faster. The air around me felt colder, sharper, like something was wrong. "Hey, do you need any help?" I asked again, stepping closer. That's when she moved slowly, almost motionless. She lifted her head and I finally saw her face. My stomach dropped. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, they were completely black. No pupils, no whites, just empty, dark voids staring right at me. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was like she was amused by something terrible. I froze, fear locking me in place. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice low. It sounded like it came from somewhere deep inside her, like she hadn't spoken in years. "What? What do you mean?" I stumbled, my throat dry. I hadn't seen this woman before in my life. She took a step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the pavement. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, like they were alive, creeping toward me. "I never got to finish trick-or-treating," she said, her smile widening unnaturally. "But now you can help me." I stepped backward, heart racing, but she was already too close. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short. Panic gasp. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Her voice echoed in my ears, growing louder, closer. "Don't you want to finish too?" My legs burned as I sprinted down the street, the houses around me blurring. I could hear her footsteps now, soft but steady, keeping pace with me. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right behind me. I rounded the corner, my lungs screaming for air, and drew myself toward a house with its porch lights still on. I pounded on the door, desperate for someone, anyone to let me in. The door opened, and an elderly man stood there, his face confused. "What's wrong?" "Please, someone's following me, She's right behind me," I gasped, glancing over my shoulder, but she was gone. The street behind me was empty, no sign of the woman, no sign of the dark-eyed ghost who had spoken to me. The old man looked at me with concern. "There's no one out there. You must have had a scare." I didn't know how to explain what I had just seen, so I muttered a quick thank you and stepped away, my heart still pounding. As I walked home, every shadow seemed to shift. Every brush of wind felt like icy fingers brushing against my skin. That night I locked every door and window, but sleep didn't come easily. Her voice still echoed in my mind. I never got to finish, and now I don't know if I'll ever feel safe to trick or treat again, because somewhere out there, she's still waiting, and one day she'll come back to finish what she started. Max was only 12 years old, and this Halloween was going to be the worst one ever. His parents had grounded him for sneaking out the weekend before, and now he was stuck in his room, while all his friends were out trick-or-treating. To make it worse, his bedroom door was locked from the outside, a punishment his parents thought would keep him in line. It was unfair, but there wasn't much he could do. Max lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the night drifted through his open window. Kids laughing, leaves crunching, the faint music of Halloween parties down the street. He sighed, wishing he could be out there with his friends, but his parents had been serious about the punishment, the grounding. As the night dragged on, the sounds from outside faded, and the house became eerily quiet. Max was about to fall asleep when he heard something strange. A scream. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him sit up in his bed, heart pounding hard in his chest. What was that? He whispered to himself. Then he heard footsteps downstairs. Someone was moving around. At first, Max thought it was his parents or his older brother Jason, maybe playing a Halloween prank on him. The footsteps came closer, climbing the stairs, slowly and deliberate. Click, click. The sound of the doorknob jingling startled him. "Open up," a voice whispered through the door. Max's heart raced, but then he chuckled nervously. "Jason, is that you? Quit messing with me. Come on, man, I know it's you." Still no response. Max rolled his eyes and turned over, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He figured his brother was just trying to scare him. Typical Jason. He'd probably give up and go back to his room without that thought. Max's eyes grew heavy, and before he knew it, he fell back to sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, waking up Max. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and sat up. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten anything since dinner the night before. He got up and went to his door, expecting it to still be locked, but it wasn't. It swung open easily. Max frowned, confused. "Mom must have unlocked it early," he mumbled. As he stepped out into the hallway, something didn't feel right. The house was too quiet, and there was a strange metallic smell in the air. He walked toward the steps, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and then he saw it. Blood splattered on the walls, smeared on the railing, and dripping down the stairs like some kind of nightmare. Max's breath caught in his throat. He froze, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Panic surged through him, and without thinking he rushed downstairs following the trail of blood. When he reached the kitchen, he stopped, dead in his tracks. The room was a mess. Blood on the floor, broken dishes, chairs knocked over. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to keep moving, terrified of what he might find. Max stepped into the living room, and his heart chattered. There on the couch sat his parents and Jason, but they weren't alive. Their bodies were slumped over, their eyes wide open, staring lifelessly ahead, their faces frozen in fear. Someone had arranged them on the couch, as if they were watching TV together, but the bloodstains on their clothes told the real story. Max couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, his vision blurred with tears. He staggered backward, almost falling. "No, no, no," he screamed, his voice cracking. Without thinking, Max bolted for the front door. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his phone from his pocket and dialed 911. His fingers fumbled, but somehow he managed to hit the call button. "911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice came through the speaker. My family. Max gasped, barely able to speak. They're, they're all dead. Someone killed them. The operator tried to calm him down, but Max couldn't focus. His mind was spinning, and he could barely comprehend what had happened. The police arrived within minutes, the flashing lights of their cars painting the street red and blue. Max stood outside, watching in a daze as the officers rushed into the house. He couldn't go back in. He couldn't face it again. As he stood there, shaking, he overheard two officers talking quietly nearby. Another one? One of them said grimly, "Just like the family we found in the next neighborhood." Max's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Another one," he answered, his voice small and trembling. The officer looked at him, hesitating for a moment. "Kid, this isn't the first. Last night another family just like yours was found the same way. We think it might be the same person." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He realized the voice he heard at his door last night. It wasn't his brother playing a prank on him. It was the killer, and he had been standing right outside Max's door. The locked door had saved his life, but the chilling thought was eating at him. If he hadn't been grounded, if the door hadn't been locked, he would have been sitting on that couch dead like the rest of his family. But what really got him was who unlocked his bedroom door. Max never celebrated Halloween again. It was Halloween night, and I was driving home after a late party. The roads were empty, and the only light came from my car's headlights, cutting through the dark. The air was cold, and the fog had begun to roll across the highway, making everything seem eerie. I wasn't scared, just tired, ready to get home. The road stretched ahead, lonely and desolate, surrounded by dense woods. I glanced at the clock, 12:15, just another hour to go. Suddenly something darted across the road, right in front of my car. I slammed on brakes, heart racing as my tires screeched. My car stopped just inches from what looked like a large deer, but it wasn't. Something seemed off. Its body was too long and its limbs seemed twisted. It didn't move like an animal should. It froze in the middle of the road, staring at me with glowing unnatural eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "It's just a deer," I muttered to myself, but I didn't believe it. Then it stood up on two legs. My blood went cold. It wasn't a deer. It was something else, something terrifying. It was tall, way taller than a man, with skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its face, it looked human, but its features were distorted, like it had worn the skin of a man and couldn't fit properly inside. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I stared in shock at the creature. It tilted its head, eyes locked on me, and then it smiled, a twisted, horrifying smile that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly it started walking toward my car, slowly and deliberate. My instincts kicked in. I flooded the gas, the engine roaring to life. The tires screeched again as I sped past the thing, my heart pounding in my chest. In my rear mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I drove away. But it wasn't over. A few minutes later, I glanced in my mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. The creature was running after me, fast, way too fast for something on foot. It was gaining on me. My foot pressed harder on the gas, the speed climbing. I was going 80 to 90 miles per hour, but the thing kept coming. I swerved around corners, my tires barely holding the road. As the forest closed in around me, the creature stayed close, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the darkness behind me. My heart raced, fear gripping me, as I realized this thing wasn't going to stop. It wanted me. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I kept driving, my pulse pounding in my ears, waiting for it to show up again, but it was gone. The road ahead was clear, and the creature had disappeared into the night. I didn't slow down till I reached the lights of the next town. My hands shaking on the wheel, I pulled into a gas station, my mind racing with what I had just seen. I couldn't believe it. It was impossible. But I knew one thing for sure. I had come face to face with a Skinwalker, and I would never forget the terror of that Halloween night. Halloween night had always been one of my favorite times of the year, but that night, everything felt off. The streets were empty, a biting chill hung in the air, and the unusual laughter and noise from trick-or-treaters had died out early. I was walking home alone, the moon hanging like a pale eye above me, casting strange, twisting shadows. The path home led past the woods, a place that always seemed darker than it should. The wind barely stirred, but I felt an icy prick on the back of my neck. My steps quickened, the silence closing in, and then I heard it, a low, mournful cry, a sound so full of sorrow that it stopped me in my tracks. It came from the woods. I stood frozen listening as the cry grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't human. No animal could cry like that. Go home now, I said to myself. I wanted to listen to the voice in my head, but instead I found myself stepping toward the trees. My heart pounded, each step heavier than the last. The deeper I walked into the shadows, the colder the air became, like the warmth of the world was being drained away. And then I saw her. At first it looked like a woman standing just beyond the first row of trees, her back to me. Her long white dress swayed in the still air, the fabric tattered and torn, but her hair, it was matted, so tangled that it seemed to move on its own, like it was alive. I should have ran. I knew it in every bone in my body, but I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted to the spot. Ma'am, my voice was weak, trembling whisper. She didn't move. The cry came again, louder, piercing the silence like a knife through flesh. I flinched, my hands reaching up to cover my ears, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to crawl into my head, twisting and withering and gnawing at my mind. I stepped back, but then she began to turn. Slowly, too slowly, she faced me. Her face, oh God, her face. It was nothing but pale, sagging skin, stretched tight over her skull. Her eyes, there were no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets that stared straight through me, and her mouth twisted into a frown, so unnatural, so grotesque, that it made my stomach turn. The edges of her lips were cracked, the skin torn, bloodless. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. Then she screamed. It was like nothing I had ever heard, a scream so loud, so filled with anguish and rage, that it felt like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. The trees around us seemed to bend toward her, the very ground trembling under the force of her cry. I stumbled back, nearly falling, but her hollow eyes stayed locked on mine, like they were going to pull me in. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted toward the street. But the scream followed me, chasing me, wrapping around me like icy fingers digging into my skin. I could hear her voice now, whispering through the cry, words I couldn't understand, words that made my blood freeze in my veins. My house came into view, but the porch light looked dim, distant, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. I felt her behind me, her presence growing, the cold clinging to my back, her cry growing louder, sharper, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I kept running. I reached the door, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. The scream was so loud now, a sound so sharp, It felt like it would split my skull into twos. I managed to get inside, slamming the door behind me. Silence. The screaming stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then something scratched at the window. I looked up, my blood turning to ice. There she was, her face pressed against the glass, her empty eye sockets staring right at me, her mouth twisted into some horrifying grin. She raised one skeletal hand and scratched the glass again, long and slow. I scrambled back, my body shaking uncontrollably, until I hit the wall. She watched me, her lips moving, but I couldn't hear the words. Only the sound of my own heartbeat echoed in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone, vanished into the night. The phone rang. The sharp sound made me jump so hard I nearly screamed. I picked it up with trembling hands, barely able to hold it. Your grandmother, she's gone. My mother's voice was shaky and broken. I dropped the phone. The Banshee hadn't come for me. She had come to announce death, just like the old legend said. But the worst part was, I knew she'd be back. The Banshee didn't just leave after one visit. She would return one day when it was my turn. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It was Halloween night and the streets were dead quiet. No kids in costume, no laughter, just an eerie silence that hung in the air. I just left the party, walking home by myself, when I felt it. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I glanced around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. I shook it off, pulling my jacket tighter against the chill, and checked my phone. The screen glowed faintly in the darkness, and I was so focused on texting a friend that I almost didn't notice the shadow at the end of the street. Someone was standing there. I stopped, heart skipping a beat. The figure was tall, dressed in black, and motionless. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but their face was covered by a pale white mask. No features, just empty, staring holes where eyes should have been. A chill ran down my spine. It's just a costume, I told myself, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter died in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I quickened my pace, my shoes tapping louder against the pavement. The figure stayed put, but my pulse raced. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air around me grew colder, like the world itself was closing in. I turned the corner hoping to lose him. For a moment I thought I was in the clear, but then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, matching my pace. I whipped around. He was still there, closer this time. The way he moved like he was gliding. It wasn't natural, it wasn't right. My heart pounded in my chest, and the blood rushed in my ears, drowning out every sound except those footsteps. He was following behind me. Hey, I called out, trying to sound tough, but my voice wavered. He didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, as if he was amused. I backed up, my hands starting to shake. I couldn't see his eyes behind that blank mask, but I could feel them watching me, studying me. Then he stepped forward. That was enough. I turned and ran. My breath came in short, gasped. As I sprinted down the street, the footsteps quickened behind me, growing louder, faster. He was running now, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement. I could hear him closing in. I darted into an alleyway, thinking I could lose him, but when I glanced back, he was still there, just a few steps behind me. The streetlights flickered, casting his shadow against the walls, making him seem even larger than me. I reached my house, my fingers fumbling with the keys as the footsteps grew louder. My hands were shaking, so badly I dropped the keys twice before finally shoving them into the lock. I drew the door open and slammed it behind me, locking it quickly. I stood there pressed against the wall, panting, my chest heavying. I listened, straining to hear anything. For a moment there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just the pounding of my heart that I could hear in my ears. Then came the knock. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped, every muscle in my body growing rigid. The knock was slow and terrifyingly calm. I crept toward the door, heart hammering, and peered through the peephole. He was right there, inches away from the door. His mask filled the entire view so close I could see the faint scratches on his surface. He lifted his hand and knocked again, his head tilting to the side like he was trying to see through the door. Knock, knock, knock. I stepped back, choking on breath. I didn't realize I was holding. My phone slipped from my shaking hands, dropping to the floor. The knocks kept coming, slow and steady. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside my door. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, listening to the silence, praying he was gone. I peeked through the pie hole. Again, nothing. The porch was empty. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. A soft tapping sound came from the window. I turned, my stomach dropping. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to walk to the window. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. He was there. His face was pressed against the glass, the mask slightly fogged from his breath. His fingers were tapping lightly against the window pane, almost playful. It had tilted again, that same eerie movement like he was sizing me up. His mask was featureless, but I could feel the grin underneath. He pressed his fingers against the window, dragging his fingers down slowly, the squeak of the glass filling the room. I fell back, knocking over a lamp. The noise didn't startle him. He just stood there, tapping on the glass, waiting, watching. The police arrived minutes later, but when I opened the door, he was gone. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone at that window. The officers reassured me, told me they patrolled the area, but I knew they wouldn't find him. That night I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, every nerve on edge, every creak of the house, every brush of wind made me jump, but he didn't come back, at least not that night. But I know he's still out there. I can feel it. Every Halloween I sit by the window, waiting for the knock, because I know it's not over. He's waiting too, and one day he'll be back, and this time I don't think he'll leave.